Hello everyone, welcome to today's class. The topic that we are going to see today is Android permissions. So I'm going to cover this topic in two parts. This is the first part. So moving on to the introduction, in an attempt to maintain security, that is system integrity and user privacy on Android, devices usually run each app in a limited sandbox. So by sandbox, we usually mean an environment in which programs can be executed or run without hampering the system or OS or any other applications, right? So Android's app permissions build upon a central design point of the Android security architecture. So by default, no app has permission to perform any operations that would adversely impact other apps or applications, the operating system and the user. So if the app wants to use resources, say for example camera, storage, network, or information, say for example contacts, so which are usually outside of a sandbox, then the application must request for permission. Now let us move on to the history of permissions. So prior to the Android version 6, which is also known as Marshmallow, and the API is 23. So prior to API 23, apps usually requested for permission at install time, right? So by install time, we mean during install the app from say the App Store. And these permissions were usually listed in the Android manifest.xml file, right? So this is how it used to be listed in the Android manifest.xml file. You use the user's permissions, okay, and then the Android permission, which is write external storage or the read external storage. So these are some of the permissions which will access my external storage, and these were used to be listed in my Android manifest.xml file. Now, what are install time permissions? So before the Android version 6, which is the Marshmallow, the user used to grant permission at install time, and Google Play used to list these permissions for the app when we used to install some applications. Say for Snapchat, if we wanted to install this in a device whose API is lower than 23, or whose Android version is lower than 6, right? So during installing this Snapchat, the list of the permissions used to appear to the user. Therefore, the user, if he accepted it, all the permissions would be getting access, right? So moving on to the next part. So the app usually stopped working by the system as soon as it tried to perform any operation that it doesn't have the permission for. Okay, so it used to give some exception, like this kind of exception, fatal exception, and it used to give a dialog box telling the user that this feature cannot be used since this permission was not granted by the user. Okay. Now, there are some ways of viewing permissions. So a user can view the permissions in the settings by going to the settings and apps portion, right? So if say here we have an Android tic-tac-toe app, and if you wanted to see what permissions were given for this app initially, then if you go to the settings and apps portion, then you could see the permissions. So as you can see, for the Android tic-tac-toe app, no permissions were requested, but for the Messenger app, you can see the permissions that were requested are given here, listed here, right? Also, developers can see device permissions via command line, and this command line is the adb shell pm list permissions -s. So using this command line, the developers usually can see the permissions that are given for any application. Now there were some changes made to permission. What are the changes that were made? So the changes were made to Android version 6, or which is also known as Marshmallow. Okay, and the API level for Android version 6 is API 23, right? So the API 23 introduced some changes to permissions, and we can see the types of permissions that were introduced in API 23 as listed here. So the permissions have some types. So the types are install time, which is the pre-version 6, and the new permissions that were introduced in the API 23 or Android version 6 were this normal permissions, the dangerous or runtime permissions, and the permission groups. Now, if we want to know what are normal permissions. So these permissions basically allow access to data and actions that extend beyond your app's sandbox, okay, so which are not limited to my app sandbox. But however, these permissions pose little to no risk to the user's privacy and the operation of other apps. So let us have a look at some of the normal permissions here. So access location extra commands, then access network site, access notification policy, and for Bluetooth you can see the Bluetooth admin, then the change Wi-Fi multicast state, disable key guard. For internet you can see kill background processes, modify audio settings, and such, and the list goes on, right? So these permissions will allow the application to have access to some uh, features, right? Accessing this request usually poses no risk to the user's privacy or the operation of other apps. Now let us move on to the dangerous or runtime permission. So runtime permissions, also known to be as dangerous permissions, give your app additional access to restricted data, and they allow your app to perform restricted actions that more substantially affect the system and other apps. Okay, so therefore we need to request runtime permissions in your app before you can access the restricted data or perform restricted actions. So dangerous permission, as the name goes, this permission, if we allow access to it, then the application can have access to some restricted data, which can eventually lead to affecting the system and other apps. Okay, and it can also invoke the user's privacy, see what information the user has or not. And this is also known as runtime permission because the dangerous permissions have to be requested during runtime. I mean, when the application is running, at that time we need to call for the request for the dangerous permissions. So some dangerous permissions are listed here. Say you have calendar, you can read calendar and write calendar. These are the permissions, okay? And granting access to these permissions can eventually lead to reading the calendar of the user, right? You can also access camera. Then you have contacts, which is read contacts, write contacts, get contacts. For location, you can access the find location or the course location, right? And for microphone, you can record audios, and the list goes on. So you see, if this sort of permission can substantially affect the system and other apps, and also it can see some of the users private data as well. So that is why these are known as dangerous permissions. Now, moving on to the last part, which is the permission groups. So if several permissions relate to a similar capability or feature of an app or device, a system might represent these permissions as a permission group. So as you can see here, say for location, we have access find location and access course location. And these two permissions belong to a certain feature or a similar capability, right? So we can group these two. So grouping this into one permission is known as permission group. So these permission groups basically help the system minimize the number of system dialogues that are presented to the user when an app requests closely related permission. So say you want to access the find location and the course location as well. You don't need two dialog box telling the user to grant access to each of this request. You can do this by showing one permission where the permission group has all of this, where the permission group will ask for requests to the user for all of these permissions, right? So moving on to the permissions after the Android 6.0 version, or the Android 6. Or the Marshmallow, which is known as the API 23. So all the normal and dangerous permissions, they were still placed in the app's manifest. But if the device is Android 5.1 or lower, or if the app targets API level 22 or lower, then user must grant dangerous permissions at install time, or else the app won't install. So you can see, if the device that we are using is basically Android 5 or lower than Android 6, okay, or if the API level is lower than 23, then we need to grant permission to the request. Then we need to grant some permissions at install time, okay. But if the device is Android 6 or higher and app targets API level 23 or higher, then even at that time all the permissions are listed in the manifest, but the app must request each dangerous permissions while the app is still running. So this permissions should be requested during runtime. So after you have installed the app, say you want to use a feature which requires your location, so you need to ask for this permission during the runtime. Okay, now this will be all for your part 1. Okay, in the next video we will see the part 2, which is the how do you declare request, or how do you request permissions for an application. Thank you. This will be all for today.